respiratory system. We can break it down into functional organization or structural organization. So if we break it down structurally, then we have what we call the upper respiratory tract, which are all of the structures basically in your head and above your neck. So our upper respiratory tract is going to be like your nose and your nasal cavity and then your pharynx. And the larynx is like the border between your upper and lower respiratory tract. So don't worry, we'll go over all of these organs in detail in a minute. I just want to show you how we're classifying them. So that would be the upper respiratory tract. Then from the larynx down is the lower respiratory tract. So we go from the larynx to the trachea. This is the trachea right here. The trachea is going to branch off into what are called, they branch off into bronchi in the lungs. The bronchi are going to get smaller and smaller until we get to little things called bronchioles. And then the bronchioles are going to give way to our alveoli, which are our air sacs. So all of that's part of the lower respiratory tract by structure. If we look at the organs of the respiratory system by function, then we split it into two categories. The conducting zone, and just like it sounds, it conducts air to the respiratory zone, which is where gas exchange happens. So our conducting zone conducts air to the respiratory zone. So most of the respiratory system by functional organization is the conducting zone. And what's our respiratory zone? This is the actual site of gas exchange. So it's the teeniest, tiniest little bronchioles and these ducts that all of our alveoli are hanging off of. So our alveoli are like air sacs, and they hang off of respiratory bronchioles like grapes hanging off a stem. So the respiratory zone is the site of gas exchange, and it only includes our respiratory bronchioles, alveolar ducts, and alveoli. So those are the two ways that we organize it. We'll talk about all of the structures now in greater detail. Actually, first we should talk about respiratory mucosa. So our respiratory tract, the innermost lining of our respiratory organs is a mucosal membrane. And so in general, if we look at the general structure of our mucosal membrane, it's got a layer of epithelial cells, and in general they're ciliated, but you'll also find goblet cells in there that are making mucus. So if we're going from the deepest layer to the most superficial layer, deep being on the inside, superficial meaning being here on the outside of it. So our deepest layer has epithelial cells that are in general ciliated. And goblet cells. And goblet cells are always round cells that are producing mucus. If we look deep to that, then we have a basement membrane. Then we've got lamina propria, which is connective tissue, areolar connective tissue. And then outside of that, well, in our lamina propria, it also has blood vessels and things. And then that's going to just be our general structure. So an epithelial layer, the basement membrane, our lamina propria. And if we look at the epithelium as we move from superior to inferior, it gets progressively thinner. So that when we start in our upper structures, in the nasal cavity, we actually have pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelium, which are pretty darn thick for just an epithelial layer. So because those cells are really big. So in the nasal cavity, we've got pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelium. And the job of these cells is going to be to beat our mucus along the surface so that we can get back to the pharynx and swallow it. So we also have this in the nasal cavity. It's found in parts of the pharynx, the nasopharynx, in your trachea, and in your main bronchi. So this is found in the nasopharynx, the trachea, and what are called your main and lobar bronchi. So just your biggest bronchi are going to have pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelium. So it's going to be a pretty thick layer, relatively speaking. Now when we get to our what are called segmental bronchi that are serving different segments of each lobe, and our larger bronchioles, we have simple columnar epithelium. These are also ciliated, and those are found in what are called segmental bronchi. And our largest of bronchioles, so not our respiratory bronchioles, but in largest bronchioles. So as we move down, it gets progressively thinner. Next, when we move down to our terminal bronchioles and the beginnings of our respiratory bronchioles, we'll have simple cuboidal epithelium. So this is just a cuboidal cell layer thick. And this will be in our terminal bronchioles and the larger part of our respiratory bronchioles. Then we're going to get down to our alveoli, which is the site of gas exchange. So there we have to have the thinnest possible layer, so it'll be a simple squamous epithelium. So this makes up our alveoli, which are our air sacs. So it gets thinner and thinner and thinner. There are a couple places that have non-keratinized stratified squamous epithelium because these portions of the respiratory tract are going to be exposed to abrasion. So anytime you've got stratified squamous epithelial tissue, you should be exposed to abrasion. And these cells are non-keratinized because keratin is a waterproofing agent. Well, mucus is going past. You don't want to waterproof your mucus. So we've got exceptions in areas that are exposed to abrasion. So a place called your oropharynx, which is just posterior to your oral cavity, your laryngopharynx, which is just posterior to your larynx. So your nasopharynx is this region here, just posterior to your nasal cavity. Your oropharynx is this part right here, posterior to your oral cavity. Your laryngopharynx is this part right here, posterior to your larynx. So all of those places have non-keratinized stratified squamous epithelial tissue. And the superior aspect of your larynx. So superior larynx. And these have stratified, let me specify, non-keratinized stratified squamous epithelial tissue. And that's because these places have to endure abrasion. So these are abrasion resistant. So food's going past, so we have to be able to wear off some of those cells. All right. So that's actually a lot of the structures you need to know. So your nose, if we look at your nose, it's got two portions. The external portion that is all this floppy skin, and then the internal portion, or this superior portion, is made of bones. So your nose is going to function to basically bring the air into your nasal cavity. So nose brings into nasal cavity. What's your nasal cavity? That's this whole region here where we've got those nasal concha. The nasal concha, the function of those concha is to create turbulence. And we want to create turbulence so that we can whack the air that we're breathing into that mucus, so that they get entrapped into that mucus, and if there's any debris in it, then it gets beat back to your pharynx where we can swallow it. So for the nasal cavity, it's going to do a couple things. The functions are that it's going to warm and humidify air, and it's going to create turbulence so that any inhaled debris can be caught in mucus. So create turbulence to trap inhaled debris in mucus. So this would be an area where the respiratory and immune systems are actually working together. This would be a barrier to entrance in the body. This would be part of that first line of defense, preventing the entry. So if you breathe in a pathogen and we stick it in mucus and we swallow it, then we can get it down to our stomach, and there's hydrochloric acid in there, and hydrochloric acid is a strong acid. There's not much that can survive it. Some things can, but not everything. So that's going to be where our respiratory system is actually helping provide innate immunity by giving us that mucous membrane that can entrap any foreign particles that we might inspire. So that's the most important part of the nasal cavity. From our nasal cavity then, air is going to pass to the nasopharynx. So the pharynx has a dual role in the respiratory system and the digestive system. And it's got three regions. The nasopharynx, which again is posterior to the nasal cavity, and it's only conducting air, unless you're blowing milk out your nose because you're laughing really hard. In general, its job is to only conduct air. Your oropharynx is posterior to oral cavity, and it conducts food and air. And then your laryngopharynx is posterior to your larynx, and it also conducts food and air. Where does it conduct it to? Next, that air is going to go to our larynx. So your larynx is a pretty complicated organ. You can kind of see part of it right here. The lay people call this your voice box. So your larynx is your voice box, and it's going to conduct air to the next part, our trachea. So as far as our larynx goes, this is a model of the larynx, so you'll have to study this for your lab. And it's got some cartilages you have to recognize. This is your thyroid cartilage. There's another little one. We've got a different larynx model I'll grab. You can see the cricoid cartilage is under here. That one's pretty big. We can go through all the different cartilages you have to know when we get to the lab. But inside the larynx, we've got this slit. That's called your glottis. That's what air is going to go through, is your glottis. All around your glottis are vocal folds. And I'm not going to make you worry about the specific types of different vocal folds, but your vocal folds are this tissue that as you're breathing, as air goes through your larynx, basically it's vibrating so that you can cause sound. So your larynx is really, it's going to help conduct air, but it is also going to be able to produce sound. So for our larynx, this is also known as the voice box. And in it, we've got the glottis, is the slit that lets air through. It also contains vocal folds that vibrate to produce sound. Now, just being able to vibrate to produce sound does not give you the ability to speak. Speaking is a complex learned task that requires the coordination of skeletal muscles in your mouth and your tongue. So this is just producing sound. Our other larynx model has a better epiglottis than this does because you can actually flop it back. So when you swallow, you've got this structure called the epiglottis that when you swallow, the base of your tongue lifts, and as it lifts, it pushes your epiglottis back. And your epiglottis, epi means upon, sits upon the glottis and blocks it so that food doesn't go down your larynx. So if you swallow, if things go down the wrong pipe, it's a failure of your epiglottis, basically, and something's gotten through into your trachea is where we'll go next. But then you should cough and hopefully be coughing it up so that you can swallow it the way you were supposed to. All right. So from your larynx then, we go next to your trachea. So your trachea is inferior to the larynx. We can see the trachea on this model. So inferior to the larynx, but right before it splits, that's all the trachea. And the trachea is going to conduct air to what are called our left and right main bronchi. And its structure is kind of unique because it's got to be able to allow food to pass behind it in the esophagus. So we'll say it conducts air to main bronchi. And if you look, like histologically, you'll be able to see it today, and on your cats you can see it too. If we look in the front of our trachea, all of these rings are called tracheal cartilages, and they're C-shaped. So it's got these C-shaped cartilages on the front. That's a tracheal cartilage. And the function of the tracheal cartilage is to keep the trachea open despite the pressure changes that are happening throughout breathing. So the tracheal cartilages are going to maintain the shape. But then behind it, it's got this kind of muscular layer, this smooth muscle layer called the trachealis muscle. And that's important because behind that is our esophagus. And there have been times when we've all been really hungry, and so you don't chew very well, and you swallow this huge lump of food, and you can feel it going down the whole way, and it hurts. And what it's doing is it's pushing into your trachealis muscle, but I mean it also is hurting your esophagus because you're stretching it too much. But that trachealis muscle is going to allow for some movement. It'll push in so that the food can go, the bolus of food can go past without disrupting your airflow. All right, so you have a figure of your bronchial tree, which we can kind of see in this model here. So when we first split off the trachea, we're going to go into left and right main bronchi. So we just have two main bronchi, and they still have complete rings of cartilage, I guess they don't have a trachealis muscle, so it is now a complete ring of cartilage that's holding them open. So we've got a left and a right main bronchi. And we can say this begins our bronchial tree. So they've got complete rings of cartilage. We've also got some smooth muscle in there. But they're going to be able to maintain their shape because they've got that whole that whole ring of cartilage around it. From our main bronchi, we split into lobar bronchi that serve different lobes of the lungs. So if we look at our lungs, our right and left lungs are sided. Our left lung has a superior and an inferior lobe. Our right lung has three lobes, a superior, middle, and an inferior lobe. So from our bronchial tree, on the left side is going to split into superior and inferior lobar bronchi. Our right main bronchi is going to branch into superior, middle, and inferior bronchi. Our lobar bronchi, so inferior lobar bronchi. These are all lobar because they're serving a specific lobe of the lung. These are going to branch next into segmental bronchi you don't need to worry about all of the different segments. So, because they're just serving different segments of each lobe. So our segmental bronchi come next, and they serve, and that would be in both left and right, and they serve segments of each lobe. These are going to branch into larger bronchi that are ultimately going to give way to bronchioles, which are smaller. In our bronchioles, we start losing some of this connective tissue so that we become more muscular as you go down. And our larger bronchioles are going to give rise to terminal bronchioles. And so these are having, so we'll say, less connective tissue. They're becoming more muscular. Then we get to our respiratory bronchioles, and there's almost no connective tissue at all. Our respiratory bronchioles then are going to lead into our alveoli. So our alveoli are our air sacs. So that's the bronchial tree. The bronchial tree is leading to our alveoli. This is the last thing we'll talk about today, and then I'll let you get to lab. Woo! We're going to have to probably finish lab. We'll finish labs first thing tomorrow. So if we look at our alveoli, what's the structure of an alveoli? It's an air sac. It's made of two types of cells. Our simple squamous epithelial cells are going to be the cells that make up most of our alveoli. And they are, so most of our alveoli are just simple squamous epithelial cells that are also called type 1 alveolar cells. And so type 1 are going to be the most abundant. So you have to look at alveoli today under the scope. So they are these air sacs that you'll see. The other cells that you'll find present there are called type 2 alveolar cells, and their job is to produce this stuff called surfactant. Surfactant is like a detergent-like material that increases the surface tension of your alveoli so that they don't collapse when you breathe out. So if you look at the relationship of an alveoli, or the alveoli, to a respiratory bronchiole, a respiratory bronchiole comes down, and then you have a whole bunch of sacs of alveoli hanging off of it like grapes. And those alveoli are made of type 1 cells, which are simple squamous epithelial cells, and type 2 cells that produce surfactant. We'll talk more about that tomorrow. So those are all of the structures you need to be aware of.